Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita, Kansas government and public policy. We're broadcast on KGPT channel 26.1 and its companion website, kgpt26.com. On today's show, my guest is James Franko, who is Vice President and Policy Director at Kansas Policy Institute. KPI is an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for free enterprise solutions and the protection of personal freedom. KPI says its work is focused on state and local economic issues in Kansas, with particular emphasis on education, fiscal policy, and health care. Kansas Policy Institute empowers citizens and legislators with credible research and creative ideas to promote a low-tax, pro-growth environment that preserves the ability to provide high-quality services. Now, my interview with James Franko of Kansas Policy Institute. Well, James Franko, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. So, we hear a lot of talk about regulation. That's really a sore spot for conservatives a lot, but usually the discussion is talking about regulation at the federal level. This week, the Kansas Policy Institute, where you are vice president, released a study that is different because it focuses on state and local regulation, specifically here and in Kansas and Wichita. So this was done by, first of all, not directly by Kansas Policy Institute, but by the Hugo Walsh School. Who is the Hugo Walsh School, and what did they do for you?
It's the public affairs school at Wichita State University. So this is where they train erstwhile policy wonks to go out and get undergraduate degrees and masters to go out and make the world a better place, I suppose. But they also do a lot of good research in the area. For a variety of different groups, business groups, community groups, governmental groups, and then groups like us too. And we wanted to be able to tap into that expertise in order to pursue the project with them.
And I know Hugo Wall often does lots of things for the city of Wichita. Right. For example, a lot of interns work for the city and things like that. So in your introduction that you wrote to this study, here's a little quote. It says, "Surprising to some, the businesses interviewed did not have as much of a problem with the regulations themselves or the need for regulations, but rather with their application and enforcement." So tell us a little bit about that.
Right, and I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to partner with an entity like the Hugo Walsh School, is because we don't view this as a kind of a partisan issue, and our hunch was that this might be the finding, is that people typically associate business owners with kind of right of center politics and whatnot, but even those folks who are here, small business owners overwhelmingly, didn't think that it is the regulation themselves. It's all the follow-on things that come from the regulation. You and I, or the people watching, may come to different conclusions about the appropriate level of regulation if you view it as some continuum. And that's always going to be the case, right? But the overwhelming finding of these focus groups is that it wasn't that we don't want to be regulated from the business perspective. It was just tell us how you're going to do it, be transparent with how you're going to apply those regulations, give us a chance to comply, and then let's be accountable on the back end as well. And that is where the conclusions came out of the paper.
I think maybe the word predictability was used quite a bit in there. And yeah, that may illustrate some of the problem with regulatory reform, especially at the local level. In my role as, at wichitaliberty.org, I get people calling me up from time to time, and they have horror stories about local regulation, both at the city mostly, and somewhat at Sedgwick County. Really just bizarre stories about how they're treated by the regulators. But these people almost always want to remain confidential. They won't let me write a story about it, and I think part of it is they don't want to be critical of City Hall and the bureaucrats, because a lot of these people have to have an ongoing relationship with these regulators. They're going to need more building permits in the future, or they want to be treated fairly on city bidding processes or something like that. Is that part of what you think underlies some of the frustrations that businesses had?
I think so. Initially, in trying to put the focus groups together, he ran into some trouble, but you'll note in reading through the paper that we're not actually identifying one individual business as voicing
It's
these
all
complaints,
anonymous.
right? It's all anonymous. It's trying to get broad cross sections of different industries, different community groups, like the Wichita Independent Business Association or the Sedgwick County Farm Bureau, so that one, it's not just one person's bad experience, right? But it's trying to tag into some overriding themes as well. We actually had a follow-on project to this that was actually nipped in the bud because somebody had just that, an ongoing relationship where they needed to get their license renewed.
Yes.
For a separate business, but because of that, renewal process, they didn't want to talk about another problem that they're having for fear that it would have kind of blown up on them and their other application would have been either delayed or been put through the ringer, so to speak.
Yeah, because sometimes these regulators have a great deal of discretion in how these regulations are enforced, I guess.
Right, which is one of the key findings of the paper in and of itself, is that while you want some discretion and latitude, it seems like one of the takeaways, so to speak, is that discretion oftentimes goes not in trying to bring folks into compliance, but in almost a punitive type relationship between the regulator and the regulated, as it were, to where they're not trying to help people come into the compliance. They're using that discretion to, pretty much wag their finger at somebody who's making a good faith effort to try to come into compliance.
Yeah, and so that's why people don't want to maybe risk antagonizing the regulators. So I think the study was done in 3 steps, or there's 3 parts to it. The people at Hugo Wall kind of wrote an introduction about regulation, what's kind of the theory, how does it work, some things like that. Then they conducted interviews with local business people, and then they had the focus groups. And all of that, the comments from the focus group are in kind of an appendix to this. Right. And this is only about 10 or 12, well, actually about 17 pages long. So it's not a real long.
No, and I would say, I haven't totaled it up, but about half of that is a list of the different regulatory regimes.
Well, here's an example of statutes and so forth that, and I think just looking at how many pages this is kind of terrifying in and of itself.
And the actual findings of the paper are really only about 4 pages and then a couple of additional pages of comments from the focus group. So the hope was that it'd be something very consumable for the average person.
And that's really kind of been characteristic of other papers and research Kansas Policy Institute has done. They aren't book-length things. They're designed really for a popular audience, and I think people appreciate that.
We certainly hope to try to get there. I mean, some papers are a little bit denser than others, but ultimately the idea is that you're taking these very Byzantine sometimes concepts and really wading into the numbers and whatnot and trying to make it consumable so that the average citizen who's busy running a business, working a job, raising kids can still find a chance to be informed on what it is that's before them.
Well, hold on to that thought, James. We need to take a break for a commercial here. I'm Bob Weeks on Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me, James Franko of Kansas Policy Institute. Well, in the first part of the book, one of the sentences there was, licensing requirements and other regulations can also pose barriers to entry and reduce competition. And this is something that I think Wichita has a real problem with. In 2012, we revised our taxi cab ordinances, and these regulations in Wichita say if you want to have a taxi company, you have to have a central office staffed at least 40 hours per week, a dispatch system operating 24 hours per day. They're talking about, a radio, radio thing. Enough cabs to operate citywide service, and the city says that's 10 cabs, not 9 or 11, but exactly 10. And a supervisor on duty at all time cabs are operating. Those are pretty strong barriers to entry, especially now that we are in the age of Uber, I think.
They are. And, I mean, especially with something like Uber where you sign up for it and you kind of only do it when you want to. And
very low barriers of entry
very
for
low
a
barriers
person.
for entry. And it's that those barriers to entry are put in place. Let's assume that, the regulators are operating in good faith, right? But they can't possibly know what is going to come. I mean, who would have thought that Uber would have existed 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But yet we're stuck, for all intents and purposes, with this regulatory regime that's going to prevent somebody like Uber, or even somebody who maybe just wants to open, a taxi service between downtown and Bradley Fair or the airport or some of the bigger retail locations around the area, but yet they still have to be able to operate citywide, and that just seems silly and ultimately counterproductive.
And I know in October, I had a conversation with the city manager, and they said they are going to implement some regulations similar to model regulations from Uber that would make Uber legal in Wichita. Because right now, even though Uber operates, I think it's in violation of a lot of these regulations. So we have kind of a tension there where they're operating, but they're not really legal, and that opens up a lot of discretion in enforcing these types of regulations.
Right, and that's sort of, you always want tension, I suppose, between the regulated and the or because you don't want people in cahoots, right? Because that's when you might get some bad action and some regulatory capture that's discussed in the paper a little bit as well. Kind of the idea of protectionism and whatnot for existing industries. But you don't want to set it up to where you just prevent something like Uber from operating and leave it to this place where we're not actually operating under the rule of law.
Yeah.
You want it to be straightforward so that Uber can operate, or that Bob Weeks's taxi service can operate, and do so in good faith and
out in the open,
out in the open, so that way there's not this gray area. So that should something happen, then we have a situation where Bob Weeks's taxi services or the city or a passenger are in a place where, well, we weren't really supposed to be doing this to begin with. Now how do we pick up the pieces?
Yeah. That brings up one of the findings in the study was that there should be more stakeholder input, that these regulations should be developed with adequate input and vetting by stakeholders. And I know the city of Wichita has done this from time to time, but just who are the stakeholders? Now, you can imagine these taxi cab regulations. I think there were two main stakeholders. The two taxi cab companies, actually there are three, but two are owned by the same person. And then the Conventions and Visitors Bureau. And those are the stakeholders. But what about the public that uses taxi cabs? They weren't part of the stakeholders. Is that a mistake?
I think it is, but I mean, it gets to kind of a classic political problem of localized benefits and diffuse costs, right? The fact that you or I may take a cab,
once a year,
right? Because we live here and our vehicles are here and whatnot, is going to make it hard for me to say, yes, I want to make sure that the taxi cab regs are going to be, transparent and accountable and straightforward. Whereas the people who drive cabs every day have a very vested interest in making sure that those things turn out a certain way. It doesn't make them wrong.
That's good for them, the
right.
barriers to entry.
Right.
And then the Convention and Visitors Bureau, it's mostly visitors that use cabs probably, and they want to make, and some of the regulations were regarding the dress and hygiene and local knowledge of cab drivers. They have to take a test, and they had to have training and things like that.
But this is one of the charms that we get from movies when it comes to cabs, right? Is that you hop into a cab in New York City, and it's, who
knows what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah. Now, a lot of good findings there, but there was one finding I didn't find that I think we've had some trouble with, and that is layers of government conflicting with each other or overriding each other. And we've kind of hinted at that, but here's a real concrete example that really harmed people, I think. In 2008, the city of Wichita passed a smoking ban for the city. And the major feature was you could still have a smoking in your bar or restaurant if you paid a fee and installed a separate ventilation system for the smoking area. But only about a year and a half later, the state passed a pretty comprehensive statewide smoking ban. So there were a number of restaurants and businesses in Wichita that spent money on the ventilation systems only just before they hardly even got broken in. The state said no smoking at all.
Right, and I think that's always going to be, again, we've talked about tension a little bit, in kind of our democratic system of government where you have the idea of federalism, not just from D.C. to the states, but from the state to the local communities,
cities,
the idea of home rule, so to speak, right? And, if I were a business owner, that would upset me an awful lot, especially where these smoking bans typically have come into place, which is at, bars and restaurants and things like that. And to my mind, the solution to that is let's go back to letting the cities decide. because while the state's banning it, of course they're still allowing it in their own state-run casinos, right? Because they acknowledge that getting rid of smoking will...
Well, hold on to that thought, because having government follow its own regulations was something that came up in the study. So we're going to take another moment off. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with James Franko of Kansas Policy Institute. So he mentioned that some of the findings or complaints that you found in this study was that government does not follow the regulations it makes us and businesses follow. I think the prime example was the statewide smoking ban, except in the 4, I think, or so casinos that the state of Kansas owns, and they realized that a lot of gamblers like to smoke. If we say no smoking in casinos, that's going to be bad for business. And when the state owns the business, there's a different set of rules.
Right. And if I own a small bar here in town or whatnot, or maybe in Mulvane here in South Central Kansas, and somebody wants to be able to, have a cigarette while they're having a drink, they can just drive right down the road and do it legally in a state-owned facility, and that's wrong. And I think that gets to one of the bedrock principles that, 1, KPI talks about generally, but 2, very specific to this paper, is that rules should apply to everybody equally. You shouldn't have these carve-outs that support one entity or the other, that allow for, in this case, government to operate under a different set of rules than we would expect businesses to operate. 1, it just doesn't pass the smell test, right? But then 2, it sets up this kind of perverse set of incentives where, in the case of smoking bans in casinos, there's probably a plausible argument that you're actually driving traffic and business to a state-owned facility at the expense of a private facility, because people do want to be able to have a cigarette maybe if they're out drinking, and maybe they'll roll the dice while they're there. Yeah,
exactly right. That kind of brings into another thing that came up in your study, which was the headline was Unpublished Guidelines. I think you wrote, at the state level, there was a request for access to unpublished interpretation guidelines. So does this kind of point out to maybe the inconsistency, or that there's a regulation, but a business owner really doesn't know how to follow that? Lawyers, we have cases that go to appeals courts. They publish the case, and then you have an idea about how a court's going to actually interpret that rule. Is that missing from the regulatory landscape?
A little bit. I mean, you think of the idea that the state, or the city, as it were, or the county for that matter, publishes, they pass a law or an ordinance, right? Then it goes out to a regulatory agency, and they say, okay, here's the new regulation that we're promulgating to answer House Bill 1234, right? And then that regulation actually gets interpreted by somebody. And the question is, by what basis are we interpreting it? And is that basis public? Because ultimately the business owner and us as consumers are going to be responsible for that interpretation. But if we're missing the step right between the regulation and the regulator and how they're interpreting that, then that's a problem. And those should be published. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist. It just means that if this is the rubric by which my business is going to be determined to be in compliance or not, then I should be able to know that in advance, not have it be sprung on me.
And that is a principle of, I guess, jurisprudence, to use a fancy word, is that people know what the laws are. They know that if I engage in this course of action, I'm going to be in compliance, or maybe not if you don't want to be. But I think there's been a lot of articles recently about administrative law, how different that is. And I guess a lot of this kind of falls into that category of administrative law, where I was looking at the Obamacare law a couple of years ago, and we know a lot of people have trouble with that, 2,000 or so pages. But how many times does at the end of a section it say, and the secretary, referring to Kathleen Sebelius, shall implement rules and regulations to, implement this?
Because even under the best of circumstances, that secretary is going to change periodically, right? Or intermittently, as it were. And are their interpretations going to change? And this gets back to the idea of predictability and transparency that we discussed earlier. So you don't want to shut down the opportunity for interpretations of things as facts on the ground change, but you also don't want to set up a situation where this is something else we got to in the paper a little bit. One of the findings was we've moved from governing to dictating, and you don't want to be dictating things to people. You want to actually be governing, working in good faith with people so that we can come into compliance, because most people ultimately want to do that, right? They want to operate a good, safe, clean, healthy business. They don't want to spend all their time doing paperwork and hand-holding, regulators and their employees through a process when they may agree on the goal. It's just, how do you get there?
Right. And a bit of good news. In the paper, or the Hugo Wall School cited a recent report in 2014 from the Mercatus Center that ranks Kansas 10th among the 50 states in the level of business regulations, with one being the most a minimal regulatory scheme. So, there are many states worse off than Kansas is.
Right. And some of those states, you think of them, we could probably all pick out, a couple of basket cases, whatnot. I think they listed, California as being the 50th, right? But they do have certain advantages, if nothing else, history and the size of their economy that Kansas just doesn't have. So that means we're going to have to work harder. And I would go back to one of the basic premises of the paper, and one of the basic points we tried to articulate is that this should be considered the low-hanging fruit, right? Is that people agree on the regulations, on the need for them. So let's make sure that they're applied equally, that they're applied transparently, and that we're able to come into compliance before we even worry about any of the other stuff.
So concentrate on reforming
Right.
the regulatory regime, the mechanism, instead of the actual regulations first. Is that it? Or
Yeah, you're always going to have to, examine what regulations exist, right? We don't have horse and buggies anymore, so we don't need regs about how to tie up your horse outside of a drinking establishment where you can't smoke. But you want to make that an ongoing process so that you're making sure that we're working well with business owners so that they can operate a small farm or a feedlot or a restaurant, or they can build a new apartment complex, always so that you're trying to set up a system where people who want to be in compliance are given the opportunity to be in compliance based on some transparent and accountable interpretations and guidelines.
And we're out of time, but I'm just going to suggest that if the city of Wichita could have a business and capitalism friendly regulatory regime, I think that could be a competitive advantage for us in the economic development wars.
It would certainly be a competitive advantage for us economically, and I think ultimately the person who's going to be best served by that is the consumer.
Sure. Well, James Franko, thanks for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you, Bob. It's always a pleasure.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV.